Hello, students, and welcome to part 2 of the lecture video for Chapter 5. Now, once immigrants arrived to the United States, they had to show three things upon their arrival: health, money, and that they had some type of skill. Health is so that we didn't allow ravaging sicknesses into this country that would maybe decimate our populations. Money, they had to have at least a small trace amount of money to provide maybe food and shelter until they could get on their feet and find a job to support themselves. And if they didn't have a skill, they had to have a sponsor in this country that agreed to vouch for them until the person could find a job or be trained in some type of skill. Ellis Island is the most famous receiving port for immigrants, especially from Europe. Starting in 1892, immigrants were processed here, and if you go back to the Think, Pair, Share video, it was about Ellis Island. A large part of that concerned Ellis Island. Only the poorest passengers were sent here. Only 2% were denied entry, so the overwhelming majority were allowed into the country. From Ellis Island, they took a short ferry ride to New York City and their new home in America. On the west coast, we had Angel Island, which was located in San Francisco Bay, and they took in immigrants from Asia, Chinese, Japanese, etc. They opened in 1910, and to contrast it from Ellis Island, Angel Island was truly designed to filter out immigrants. We did not want a lot of Asians in this country during this time because they looked so much different. They spoke a different language. They were so much different that people during that time shunned them more and didn't want, even our government didn't want to let large numbers of them in. They had to either prove citizenship or that they had a relative who was a citizen. And many immigrants had to stay for weeks and even months in captivity while they researched and investigated their backgrounds and checked out whether or not they had relatives living in this country. Ghettos is a term for a concentration of an ethnic group within a city. So concentration of people within a city who share religion, language, and or culture. In today's day and time, we think of ghettos and we associate that with African American culture. However, that's not where it originated. Ghettos are any ethnic group living in a country, living all together in one part of the city. For example, some very large cities have what is called Little Italy, which is where the Italians primarily live. Some have Chinatown, which is where the Chinese primarily live. In Miami, there's Little Havana, which is where the Cubans primarily live. So these are called ghettos, where an ethnicity lives together in one area in a new country. Now, Americanization is a term that describes helping newcomers adopt American dress and diet and really the American culture. America has long been looked to as what they call the Great Melting Pot. It's a term describing that many nationalities blending together to create a single culture. So they come here and they keep some cultures, habits, customs they had in the old country, but by and large, they blend and melt together to make one American society. There were some people living in this country at that time that did not like the fact that immigrants were coming in, and they believed in something called nativism. Nativism refers to the belief that native-born Americans, or Americans born in this country, were just inherently superior to newcomers. So because of that, those that practice this believe that Catholics, Jews, and blacks were not as good as everyone else, and they were targets of persecution. We have the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was passed in 1882, stopping the immigration of Chinese laborers, limited Chinese civil rights, and stopped the naturalization of Chinese residents. One reason for this is because the Chinese were taking a lot of low-paying jobs that Americans were competing for as well, and the Chinese were willing to take a lower wage. So therefore, the employers liked to hire the Chinese because they didn't have to pay them as much money. So unions, which we talked about last chapter, labor unions, for one, did not like the fact that immigrants were coming into this country. And for all the reasons listed here, they were kept out. Congress also passed other acts that stopped entry to anyone that was deemed criminal, immoral, or poor. Now, the immigrants made many, many great contributions during this time. For example, the Mexicans developed new ranching techniques. In fact, our popular idea and concept of the cowboy that we have today came from Mexican culture. The Chinese and the Irish were primarily involved in building the railroads. Now, because of all this immigration and because of urbanization, industrialization, which we talked about last chapter, we had urbanization, which means cities expanding, a growth in the size and number of cities. That is what urbanization is. Now, for example, in 1860, only 16% of people lived in cities, and by the late 1800s, that number had grown substantially. Americans experienced urbanization. The number and the size of cities grow rapidly. Now, why did people move to the cities? One is, like we talked about last chapter, that's where the jobs were. The factories were in mostly urban areas and city areas. Also, cities were connected by railroads, so travel was easier. There was a variety in daily life. They could do something different and meet someone new every single day where they couldn't living on a rural farm, maybe miles away from their closest neighbor. And number three is companionship. There were more people to get to know and to be around. By 1900, 40% of our urban population, or the population within the cities, were foreign born. So almost half of the people living in the cities were born in another country. And this goes along with what we were talking about earlier, how the number of immigrants in this country exploded during this time period. Thank you for watching lecture video number 2.